All right, good morning, everyone. As you can see, once again, I have my Captain Amazing headset on, so that means it's time for another tool demo. Today, we're going to go over the bandsaw, and with that, there's a couple things we need to go over with the bandsaw specifically that you need to be aware of, so that way we can operate this thing safely and securely, and make sure that you know how to use this thing, obviously. So, to start with, the most common bandsaw you're going to see is what's called a vertical bandsaw. This is different from a horizontal bandsaw, and the reason why is because the blade on this one is actually vertical. If you look at a normal bandsaw here, the blade is upright, up and down, versus horizontal. Horizontal bandsaw, the blade would come down with a full moving head like this, and that's how the horizontal bandsaw will work. They both operate very similarly. They both have a blade that goes around two large wheels, but the way they do this is a little bit differently. The way your typical vertical bandsaw is set up is you have an upper wheel that the blade goes around, and you have a lower wheel that's actually your drive wheel. The blade also goes around. Okay, both these are critical that they're lined up with the blade, so that way the blade goes around and doesn't get bound up on anything. The next thing I want to mention are the actual blade guides. The blade guides are these two little guides right here that control how the saw blade is guided down through the throat plate here. Now, these blade guides should never be adjusted tight against the blade. The blade guides should have just a little bit of wiggle room inside there. Hopefully, you guys can see that little bit of wiggle room that we have, but they shouldn't have very much. They should be able to have a lot of saw blades move, and these ones actually need to be able to adjust a little bit. So the way you adjust them is you loosen the little set screw on the side. We can actually push this in just a little bit like that, and we'll tighten that back up. And we'll do the same thing with the other side. We'll loosen that up, and we'll move this in as well a little bit to get a little bit closer to the blade. The blade guides should never be tight, but they should allow the blade to move just a little bit side to side. So now our blade guides are adjusted well. The next thing we want to adjust is our actual blade guard. Now, if we look at our blade guard is this piece right here. And the reason it's called the guard is because it protects your hand from coming in contact with the blade itself behind the blade guard. Now, this blade guard can be adjusted up and down. The way you adjust it is we have a little tensioner wheel in the back here. We're going to loosen that wheel, and that allows us to lift our blade guard up and down. Now, what you never want to do is you never want to have all this excess blade exposed. You always want to make sure that your blade guards and blade guides are adjusted to within 1/4 of an inch above your material. So if we're going to look at this thing, we're going to notice that we want to bring this down to right about there, okay? And we can see right there, that's about 1/4 of an inch gap between the blade guides and the top of the material here, and that's all we want. If this is up all the way like that and we go to make our cut, we have all this blade our hands can become in contact with when we make our cuts. We don't want that. We want to make sure that the blade guide is all the way down and it covers as much of the blade as possible. This also helps prevent the blade from binding when you have to do slight curves on your material. So now that I have my 1/4 inch gap, I can come back over here. I can tighten my wheel back down, and now I'm pretty much ready to start cutting. A couple of things I do want to make sure I mention on these things, on these bandsaws though, these tables are adjustable to cut angles, okay? So if you ever need to adjust the table on these things, the angle adjustment's on the bottom, right down here. So we're going to loosen that wheel. This allows us to tilt our table one way or another. Now, unless you have to specifically tilt the table for one reason or another, I typically don't want you guys adjusting the tables because there's not really any reason to adjust them just because of how the bandsaw works. Okay? So apart from that, actual cutting process on these things. When you're making your cuts, there's basically two ways you want to hold your material. You want to hold your material so that way when you cut through the material and the blade comes through the back side here, you don't want to put your hand or fingers in line with the cut path of the blade. Good safety practices would say that you have your hands on either side of the material here, so that way when the blade comes through, it's not going to contact anything on the back side. So good practices are to have your hands on both sides of the material like this, or If you don't have enough room on one side, another good safety practice is to have both hands on one side of the material like this, so that way when it comes through, it doesn't make contact with anything. Now, sometimes you're in positions where you have to move your hands out of the way of the path of the blade, but you need to make sure you provide pressure to the backside of the blade as well. To do that, you want to use a piece of scrap wood to act as a push stick, okay? What is a push stick? Well, essentially, if we're to cut through the backside of this piece here, we would use this piece of wood to push a material through, so that way when the blade comes through our material, the blade will then cut into the push stick and not our hands on the backside here, okay? So you'd actually want to use something to push this through, so that way your hands won't come in contact with the path of the blade on the backside here, okay? Operation is very simple. Make sure everything's off the table before you make any cuts. Turn this thing on. Okay. If I were to cut the end off, turn the end off like this. Okay. Or I can use my push stick. Whenever that's all done, turn it off. Another good safety practice is to make sure that you clear away any scraps with other scraps. Don't get your hand too close to the blade, because if your hand gets too close to the blade, then that's considered a safety hazard, okay? Now, last thing I do want to mention on this thing is, what do you do if you have to do a long cut? The beauty of the bandsaw is that sometimes you can make really long cuts with this thing. So let's say you want to make a really long cut that goes, let's just say we're going to cut the length of our piece like that, okay? We want to make a really long cut like this. To do this, we want to do what are called relief cuts. What relief cuts are is they allow us to cut down our material before we actually have to make our long cut. So I'm going to do a relief cut starting on this end. So let's say, for an example, I want to draw in like a squiggly line like that, okay? Let's say that's what my cut path is going to be. Now, it's going to be really hard to cut that, so I'm going to kind of straighten it out a little bit. What relief cuts are going to do is they're going to allow us to cut this material without the blade binding in the material. So I'm going to want to put a relief cut here approximately, and here approximately, and then at the very end, okay? We want to do our relief cuts about every inch, and the relief cut is only going to go up to our cut line. And the relief cut is literally going to do what it sounds like. It's going to relieve the tension on the blade, so that way it's not going to bind up in our material. So I'm going to show you how to do the relief cuts. First relief cut. Second. And third. Now we can cut our profile. And that cuts it off, that's okay. Now we can see here that thanks to the relief cuts, I was able to mostly make my cut. The beauty is now I gotta have to come in and kind of smooth this out with a file or whatever I need to do to smooth it out. But the beauty of the relief cuts is it prevents the saw blade from getting bound up in the material and any bad things from happening, okay? With that, a couple of the safety procedures. Make sure when you're done with this thing, you do vacuum it off. Don't leave any sawdust on it. Don't leave any scraps on it. Make sure that when you are using these things here in class, we have the dust collector on. I didn't have the dust collector on today because it's loud and you won't be able to hear me talk. So make sure that when you are operating this thing, you do operate with the dust collector on, okay? Apart from that, the biggest safety procedures are going to make sure that you have your safety guard, your blade guard in place. Your table is clamped down, it's level. Make sure you keep your hands out of the path of the blade. And if the blade breaks, okay, don't panic. If the blade breaks, just turn off the machine and come get me, and we'll replace the blade on it. Because oftentimes these blades do break, and the last thing you want to have happen is someone get freaked out because the blade gets broken. But they do break, but usually the way they break is because someone didn't operate the machine correctly. They try to make too sharp of a curve on the cut, and it snaps the blade. So try to do your best to not do a real sharp curve on these things. If you try to do a sharp curve, chances are the blade's going to get bound up in the material, and like I said, it may snap. All right. That's pretty much it for the bandsaw, guys. Thanks for watching, and get ready for the test that's coming up.